and you just learn to roll with it. So thank you,
Yeah.
everyone. Here we are. Technology has a life of its own. Hopefully you can see the home page, which gives you my web address if you're interested for an upcoming talks. But we are looking now at, should all be seeing Artemisia Gentileschi.
Yes.
There we go.
You're good.
Artemisia Gentileschi is one of the most interesting artists in the canon. In some ways, her work responds to one of the greatest artists of her generation, a guy named Caravaggio. Caravaggio is considered a Baroque artist, and he really went off in left field with his work. One of the great innovations by Caravaggio that Gentileschi picks up on is the blackening of the background. You will see the overall blackness in the background, and that's called, in art language, though there will be no quiz today, that's called tenebrism. And the reason that Caravaggio and then after Gentileschi used that is because it makes a very nice theatrical stage set. And you can see the light that comes in off the left side and how it bathes on the faces of the two primary characters. Baroque art is known for this kind of theater. Baroque art is so different from the Renaissance art that came immediately before it. With Renaissance, you have this quest for perfection. The Michelangelos and Leonardos and Raphaels were trying to do everything just right to show a kind of perfect balance. And you know that as styles go, once something's in vogue for a while, the pendulum tends to swing to the other side. And the pendulum moved in the Baroque to this kind of very theatrical type of art where we get to see all the juicy, graphic, naughty pieces of some of the narratives. And this is what Gentileschi's done here. One of the fascinating things that you see right at the center of the painting is the great sword that the namesake of the painting, Judith, is holding. So before we even learn anything about this, we see this dark theatrical background, but we also see that something dark is about to happen here. Now, art historians have often looked at Gentileschi's imagery like this, that there's something about the darkness of the subject, the murder that she's about to participate in, as an extension of her biography. And for so long, her achievements as an artist were truly overshadowed by her biography. When she's in an earlier part of her life, there is the story of how she was raped as a younger woman by an Agostino Tassi, and the trial that goes along with that. It tends to overshadow her work, but it's very important to think about that for a moment, because we do see a kind of female heroine. We see a female painter who has gone through some real trauma in her own personal life, and how she's seeking out characters for her paintings that will establish women as being strong and being very powerful. Even in the story that we see here, Judith, a beautiful widow, is able to enter the tent of Holofernes. Holofernes was an Assyrian general who's about to destroy Judith's home city, the city of Bethulia. What she's done is basically get him drunk, and he ends up passing out. And it's at that moment, hidden away in the darkened tent at the right, that we see Judith save herself, save her town, save her people, and become an extremely powerful figure, not just in the biblical narratives, but also in the whole history of stories about strong female characters. Take a look on your screen of two different ways to do this. A moment ago, you've heard about Caravaggio and what a leader he was, and how Caravaggio puts the blackened background, tenebrism on the map, how he makes things more theatrical as a result of this, how he gets lots and lots of followers, including Gentileschi. But these are very different paintings, I'm sure you're already noticing. it would be very tempting to ask out loud, are these very different paintings because one was done by a man and one was done by a woman? You wouldn't be the first to ask these questions out loud. And we start to see more questions like these asked, especially after second wave feminism starts to become more and more popular and influential in the 1970s and into the 1980s, all the way up to today. The past 50 years, we've seen more and more conversations like these. And the story goes like this, that Caravaggio, the man of the two, shows the same subject, but in a way that seems to not give Judith the same level of power, the same level of heroine status. It's as if in the Caravaggio, and so the narrative goes, that Judith is consumed by a kind of divine inspiration to save her people, and therefore it's not really Judith doing the deed of killing Holofernes, but it's the spirit of the divine running through her that allows her to do this. This is the way Caravaggio tends to show this subject, and we don't have a lot in the Caravaggio of something that makes it look believable. Imagine what this young woman is doing. She's grabbing the head of this massive man, this general, and she's decapitating him. And yet look at her face in the Caravaggio. We don't see any struggle. Again, the story goes that she's divinely inspired, nor do we see any true reality of the blood that would come out of the head of Holofernes. It looks a bit more like red licorice, really, than what blood would be like. And so there's a lot of artifice in that. But comparing it to Gentileschi, you start seeing the struggle of Judith, how she's grabbing the head and she's working to decapitate him to save her people. You start to see the blood and the guts and the gore of all of this, all the while knowing that just outside Holofernes' tent is his whole group of followers, that this has to be done quickly, this has to be done quietly, and this has to be done with great risk all around. And so today we're beginning with a conversation that's often had: how does the subject change when Caravaggio depicts it and when Gentileschi depicts it? And does her depiction say something or suggest something about her own biography? And there's quite a few ways to tackle that. Here's another image by Gentileschi, a self-portrait, and that alone is worth a conversation, because you have to remember that the history of art is not completely populated by male artists, but it is predominantly populated by male artists. And when you think of female artists, especially from Europe or from the Americas, you start to realize why. There's a very famous essay by the art historian Linda Nochlin from the early 1970s. And she's asking out loud in the essay, why have there not been great female artists? It's a very valid question. Is it because they aren't as talented? Is it because they are women? What is the reason? And ultimately, Nochlin points out one single reason, and that is that women were excluded from academies. They were excluded from studying with the great masters. They were all around outside of the boundaries of some of the great art centers of the world. So even to see Gentileschi showing herself as an artist, holding a palette in her one hand, holding a brush in another hand, is an act of defiance. And we may not see this now, a painting from 1630, as a political painting or one showing an act of defiance, but in the 1630s, this would not have been missed by anyone. That firstly, there are so few women who are practicing painting, given the reasons mentioned. And secondly, those that do certainly don't double down like this and show women as artists. And so Gentileschi's pushing the goalpost way out in front for an art by women about women. And we can see this at the very same moment, but in a different part of Europe. Gentileschi, an Italian, Leicester from the Dutch Golden Age. At the right, Leicester also shows you what would be in her day an act of defiance. There she is with the brush in hand, there she is with the palette in hand, actually now working on a painting. And so there should be no confusion whatsoever who the artist is here. And yet, until about 1893, Leicester's whole oeuvre, her whole collection of work, was attributed to one of her male contemporaries, and that would be Frans Hals, or to her husband, another lesser known artist. We don't really know who Leicester trains with. She may have trained with different masters, but as you can imagine, the documentation of all of this is scarce, in part because she was a woman. And so in both works, you see art that is by a woman, but about womanhood, especially womanhood related to their profession as artists. Into the 1700s, we start to see things evolve a bit more. And one of the reasons can be found in this painting by Angelica Kauffmann. She was born in Switzerland, considered a prodigy in both painting and music by the age of 11, and it could have been that pushes her into the forefront and encourages her to be an artist, though opportunities would have been more limited given her gender. She's traveled all over Europe. She's starting to get some major portrait commissions, aristocratic commissions, before she even turns 20. And so we're dealing with a very special artist, certainly. One of the interesting things to be said about this work is what we can find in the background. Now, we're very tempted to look at the figures and wonder what they're doing, and that's certainly part of the narrative. But another part of the narrative is the architecture in the background. And if we can imagine the kind of building that this massive column at the far right holds up, it would probably be a classical style building, a Greco-Roman inspired building, perhaps. This was done in the era of what's considered the neoclassical, when more and more people are not only becoming very interested in ancient Greek and Roman art and architecture, but more philosophers and more thinkers are becoming more interested in the ideas encouraged by the Enlightenment, such as Rome as a republic or ancient Greece as a set of democracies. These ideas we're starting to see more and more. And the Kauffmann painting then becomes a kind of referendum about the era of enlightenment in the background and progressive social change in the background, leading us to democracies and so on. And this plays a role then in the foreground. In the foreground, what you see is a mother, and we see her with her children. And what's happening here is someone comes along and asks this woman who's out and about with her children what your treasures are. And this someone is the woman figure at the far right holding some of her treasures. She holds up her necklace and shows off her wealth and says, "This is what I have. What do you have?" And in a classic Enlightenment tale of humility and staying under the radar, the central figure says, "Well, I don't have wealth and I don't have fancy jewels, but I do have my children." And she gestures over to her children. And so it's a painting about the Enlightenment. It's a painting about forward thinking, a painting about equality, and it's a painting about motherhood and parenthood, about suggesting some of the ways that women were present in Kaufmann society and how those ideas continue. And we can see that also in the Morisot. Now we're jumping into the 19th century here, but the theme of domesticity, the theme of motherhood, the theme of children, we find all the way through the career of Morisot. Critics would have seen her as a so-called female artist. And in the late 19th century, though she was very much an impressionist, very much out in front, very much trying to change things in the world of art, it was these scenes of motherhood and these scenes of domesticity that would have encouraged critics to see her as nothing more than a female painter painting images of female domesticity. Now we look back and realize that that was clearly unfair criticism lobbed against her. The woman and child theme becomes a very tender, very gentle, very honest depiction of her life and of the people around her. Morisot derives so many of her subjects from the world of the modern upper middle class woman. This is her social status, and that too relegates her work into a very specific category, as does the work of her contemporary, Mary Cassatt, who also had to face mounting criticism about her imagery, that it's only because she's a woman that she's painting scenes like this. Now, let's be very clear. Her male contemporaries are painting children and scenes of motherhood and domesticity too, but it's because Cassatt, like Morisot, is a female artist that we see more of the scholarship about her at that time following along those lines. In fact, both Morisot and Cassatt are very much out in front and respected by their contemporaries, some with bigger names, the Monets and the Renoirs and the Degas. These are people that have trained with the household name Impressionists. These are people who are very comfortable with what's happening, especially in the school of Paris. And what Cassatt is attempting to do is, yes, depict a slice of life of raising a child or the mother and child theme, but she's also working to understand how a painting can be two things at once. On the one hand, a narrative that shows you the story, and the other hand, an object. That painting could be about its own making. The painting could be about paint on canvas. And if you look around the painting, there's some very exciting things that happen even in the brushwork. The colors and the brushwork all work together to create a very modern painting, even though the subject is a very traditional one. And when we think of modernism and we think of the 20th century, we start to see some great strides in art by women, about women, and we start to see some major artists make major names for themselves, in part because they're addressing their gender in their work. And of course, one of those major figures is Georgia O'Keeffe. One of her classmates in her early life had this to say about her. The most unusual thing about her was the absolute plainness of her attire. Nearly every girl in that study hall planned just how she was going to dress Georgia up, but her plans came to naught, for this strong-minded girl knew what suited her and would not be changed. And so some of the narrative about Georgia O'Keeffe extends to her early life, where people are noticing that she's not behaving as a good deal of the young ladies and women around her are behaving. She's the first of 5 daughters and becomes an important figure, not only in the family, but certainly in the world of art. She said, "From the time I was a little girl, if my sisters wore their hair braided, I wouldn't wear mine braided. If they wore ribbons, I wouldn't." And it's illustrative to look at comments like these, both by her, by the people around her, that suggests something of her character, that she is thinking very much about her gender, thinking about expectations, because she's a woman, and this will extend into her artistic career. At the left, a painting of Georgia O'Keeffe. It's really more painting of that dress, but it's a combination of O'Keeffe and the dress. And at the right, a photo of a party of O'Keeffe when she was still an art student here at the Art Students League in New York, before anyone knew her name, before she becomes the maker of the great objects that we know and love. And look at how she's dressed. There she is in a tuxedo. And so it's impossible to separate her work especially her work about women, and these anecdotal parts of her identity, how she in both is pushing against the grain. Here's a portrait of her around that same time that she's at the Art Students League party. And it describes someone that she comes into contact with her, someone at the school where she's studying. Spiker was one of the older students at the league and a very handsome young man, she says. He often stopped me and wanted me to pose for him. Spiker wanted to paint me, but I wanted to work myself, she says. One morning, as I climbed to the top floor for the life class, there he sat with his fresh linen smock, blocking the whole stairway and threatening that he would not let me pass unless I promised to pose for him, she went on. I was annoyed and wanted to go up to work. It doesn't matter what you do, he said. I'm going to be a great painter, and you will probably end up teaching painting in some girls' school, he says to her. I insisted on passing, and he remarked, I'll give you the painting if you pose for me. So as we look at her work, we have to remember that there are, even in the early 20th century, even in places like New York, very much epicenters of the world of art, there are some massive limitations for being an artist who happens to be a woman. We find these in art schools, we find these vis-a-vis the artist and their contemporaries, and we even find some uncomfortable situations that artists like Georgia O'Keeffe had to bear for being an art student at that time. O'Keeffe and Alfred Stieglitz end up getting together and eventually getting married in 1924 and becoming a major powerhouse in the world of art in New York. She's very interested in doing things differently, and so is he. In fact, he runs a gallery in New York called the 291 Gallery that is promoting the art of the European moderns that's still very much on the fringe. Few people in America had ever seen things by Picasso, Matisse, Cezanne, and the others. And Stieglitz is promoting all of this in New York. He gives her her first one-person show, 1917. And in 1918, she moves to New York with the promise of his financial support. And in fact, he holds to that promise, exhibiting her work at his gallery almost annually until his death in 1946. We can see here the two together. Here, a wonderful photo of Georgia O'Keeffe in Texas, still in the early part of her career. In fall 1916, she moves to Canyon, Texas, then a small town of about 1,500 people, to become the chair of the art department at West Texas State Normal College. It was a teacher's college for men and women at that time. She'll stay there for a couple of years. Stories about her time in Canyon point towards this level of progressiveness, including how she doesn't want to behave the way that that society is expecting her to behave. She doesn't want to dress the way society is expecting her to dress. Locals considered her going barefoot in public on a hot day, among other things, to be extremely curious and extremely unladylike. And we can see even in her dress, something that would have raised eyebrows at that time. Eventually, O'Keeffe will settle on a kind of art that is a hybrid, two sides of the coin. On the one side, it looks like recognizable imagery, some of which is alluded to in the title, From the Lake. And on the other side, a kind of imagery that is nearly abstract, where we don't exactly know what we're dealing with. But very early on, when O'Keeffe exhibits works like these, we start to see critics paying attention to her gender and using it to understand her work. And now let's be very clear. This is not a style of art criticism that we see related to the male artists of her generation. Very rarely would a critic identify someone as a male artist and then try to find male things about their work. But we see quite a bit of this in O'Keeffe's work related to her being a female. Murdoch Pemberton in the 1920s, he was an art critic for The New Yorker, had this to say: psychiatrists have been sending their patients up to see O'Keeffe's canvases. If we are to believe the evidence, the hall is littered with mental crutches, eye bandages, and slings for the soul. And what Pemberton is suggesting is that her work is starting to appeal to people who are trying to deal with the spiritual side of things, who are trying to deal with growth in an individual sense, especially if you were a woman. Henry McBride in the 1920s, another critic, had this to say that pinpoints this more directly. Her paintings were being whispered about, he said, because they were so suggestive. They were being prayed to by all the super respectable women of the country for receipts that would keep them out of the madhouse. Now, this kind of criticism would not stand in 2022, where we would look at her gender first and then link it to her work, nor would it stand this kind of thinking that her work helped women deal with a variety of moments in their lives. It very well may have, and some of these stories might have been true, that she attracted a stronger following of women, but it's not the kind of art criticism that we see. Her work is interesting in and of itself, whether or not it's about womanness. And I say that word womanness here when we look at Black Iris. Clement Greenberg, another critic of the day, said, her art seemed little more than the private worship and the embellishment of private fetishes with secret or arbitrary meanings. Her canvases are little more than tinted photography. Ouch. This is not the kind of criticism you want. And she would have felt how truly sexist this kind of criticism was, that her work is tinted photography because she happens to be a woman and because her partner and eventual husband happened to be the photographer, Alfred Stieglitz, all around not giving her the same level of respectability that her male counterparts would have had. But that first part of the Greenberg quote is revealing, because he suggests the term private worship. What does private worship mean? In the way Greenberg means it, these are paintings that show, in his mind, an artist looking at her body and looking at the source of her womanhood, her vagina, the center of what makes her a woman. Now, people have often thought about that in relation to O'Keeffe's work. Maybe these are self-portraits in a way, but there's enough evidence to suggest that O'Keeffe is dabbling in the kind of art that is both abstract and something specific. So it's a Black Iris, but it's also so closely viewed that it loses its form as a flower and instead becomes an abstract painting. If these are self-portraits of her womanhood, then that's something O'Keeffe certainly didn't talk about. But it's something that critics like Greenberg alluded to. And it's something that sticks with us today, that these are images of her naked body. Frida Kahlo is someone of O'Keeffe's generation who also had to deal with some of these ideas that because she was a woman, there should be something about womanhood or womanness in her work, even if there isn't. Here's a work that shows what it was like for Kahlo to live between two worlds. And some of us do live between two worlds or more. And this could be, maybe we were born in another country, but live in a different country. There's a variety of identities that can go along with feeling like you're 1 foot in one world and 1 foot in another. Here's how Kahlo represented that. On the left is Mexico. On the right is the United States. And so she's got 1 foot in each of these two worlds. The sun and the moon are only over Mexico. The cloud of the industry hangs over America. Notice she's holding the Mexican flag, yearning for her homeland. She and her husband, Diego Rivera, were traveling through the US in the early 1930s. And we see Kahlo dealing with that, a kind of hybrid figure who is in America, but longing for her homeland. And so again, showing herself, one of her many self-portraits in her work. There is, by the 1940s, a different level of scholarship that can be applied to some very interesting work, including the work of Louise Bourgeois. Femme maison translates to housewoman. And here at the right, we can see how Bourgeois suggests that as a woman, she feels under pressure to live a domestic life, that she feels under pressure to have children and to, as an artist, render herself as someone who is able to have children. And so what we see at the right are different parts of her body that would be used in childbearing emphasized, and then other parts of her body, like her feet and her head, all but reduced or eliminated. This is very much in the line of the kind of writings that Simone de Beauvoir was working on at the same time. You'll know that de Beauvoir publishes her very famous book, The Second Sex, in 1949, just 2 years after Bourgeois makes Femme Maison. The Second Sex begins about herself, de Beauvoir, but then it goes on to become a treatise about all women. The book details women's oppression. It really lays the philosophical foundation for capital F proper feminism that wouldn't happen until at least the 1960s and into the 70s. Here's Bourgeois' The Destruction of the Father from the 1970s, at a moment when feminism is now more widespread than it was earlier in her career. Here's a work that is very much about domesticity and raising children, and also about her relationship to her father. She sees her father as being domineering within the family, untrustworthy, someone who has an affair with the nanny in the household. And here, the destruction of the father is a kind of takedown of the power that her father had in the family and the power that he has over her. Here, in Arch of Hysteria, Bourgeois again makes a work of art that is inextricably interwoven with her gender as a woman, as she comments on the notion of hysteria. You've all heard that term, hysteria, and when someone laughs really loudly, you might even say that they're hysterical. It's one of those terms that still very much floats around our society. You might want to rethink using that term hysteria after you hear this and choose a word like hilarious that would be better, because hysteria is a term that comes from a very specific connotation. It's a connotation that was promoted by a neurologist called Charcot. And Charcot plotted behaviors of women on a spectrum. And if your behavior as a woman was out of the bounds of what's considered appropriate, Charcot would have considered you hysterical. And if you were plotted with these behaviors in an arch, in the bad arch, in the hysterical arch, then this could mean some pretty significant ramifications for you. You don't want to be hysterical. And here Bourgeois shows you a sculpture that resembles an arch, therefore the arch of hysteria, a kind of system that guides female behavior. We all know that sometimes women behave outside the bounds of what's considered respectable. We all know so do men. And it has nothing to do with gender. It just has to do with what society is considering appropriate behavior. But the notion of hysteria begins as a gendered idea. Here, Bourgeois gives you a very heavy sculpture. This is made of bronze. This is very heavy. And it hangs by a very thin string at the top, suggesting a kind of fragility of this, that very thin string holds up this very heavy sculpture that, should the sculpture fall, it could almost become a weapon. And this kind of danger is something that Bourgeois includes here. Notice that the figure is neither male nor female, that though the Arch of Hysteria is about female behaviors, data points of female behaviors, Bourgeois is suggesting that this is a situation about behavior, not about gender. Both men and women have behaviors that are sometimes outside the status quo. When we see her work with spider imagery, we make more sense about her use of that very thin thread that held up the sculpture in the Arch of Hysteria. Bourgeois spent quite a bit of time in her career thinking about spiders and thinking about the threads of spiders. One reason is that her family were tapestry restorers. They were weavers. And this is how she becomes an artist. You think of a spider as a weaver. I mean, probably not any better animal that's a better weaver than a spider. And it's something that then becomes a signifier for her upbringing and for her parents, who were also weavers. Like the Arch of Hysteria, we have a work that is about female identity, and it's about female identity at large, but also a specific female identity in her own life. Maman is her mother. This work refers to her mother, a tapestry restorer, as a spider. And notice that there are two ways to see her mother here. She's, on the one hand, large and powerful. Look at the size of that sculpture related to the people underneath it. On the other hand, we can see the sack of eggs underneath the spider that when you walk through it, you would have great access to. And we start to realize that while this is a strong, powerful creature, this is also a very maternal creature, here protecting her eggs in a very maternal, very delicate way. And so Maman becomes a referendum about her own relationship with her mother, at once strong, powerful, but also maternal, but also a referendum of how society traditionally has treated women along these same lines, that they're read vis-a-vis this maternal lens, but also through this fearful lens. Lots of fascinating things to be said about her spider work. Louise Nevelson is another great artist from the middle of the 20th century. Here, in one of her quasi-architectural sculptural installations, meaning it's born from sculpture. Here we have various three-dimensional pieces put together, but it becomes a bit like a room. You can walk into this sculpture in a way that makes it almost like an architectural piece. And many artists of her generation were trying to balance that line of what is a sculpture and what is a work of architecture, and how can we play between the two. We can even see the spider as one of those works in that idea, that it's so big that you can walk through it like you would walk through a room, but obviously it's also a sculpture. We can see the white overpainting here as a reference to wedding nuptials, a reference to something pure, something related to virginity, all of these expectations that have been on women, especially in her own time in the 1950s. It's one of the pieces that puts Nevelson's name on the map, in part because it references female identity, but does it in a less direct way. We don't see a naked woman here. We don't see a heroine here, like we've seen in the Gentileschi image at the beginning, but instead we see a very subtle reference to the nuptial white, the traditional color of the wedding vows. One of the great artists of the 20th century is Alice Neel. And what makes her so fascinating is that she's very interested in depicting people the way they are, not only the way they hope to be depicted. Now, I don't know that you've ever had your portrait done, but one of the things you might ask of the portrait painter or photographer is there any way that you can make me look really good? You know, can you make me look better than I do? We all want to look our best in images like this. And the answer was traditionally, of course. And you start to see artists learn how to idealize their portrait sitters, but not Alice Neel. If you didn't want to be seen for who you were, then you wouldn't want Alice Neel to paint you, because she stripped off that idealized layer and went right down to the marrow and showed people for who they really are, including Linda Nochlin at the left. She's the author of the essay I mentioned earlier, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists? And herself at the right. Two things to be said. One, Linda Nochlin's essay about women in art was so important that it really galvanized her role as a prominent art historian. We would think of her maybe behind a podium or in front of a classroom in an image. But here, Neel shows her in a domestic role, something that is not truly what she's known for. She's got her public life, but also her private life. And she shows herself at the right in a way that recalls what we saw at the beginning with Gentileschi and Leicester, holding the brush, holding the rag in the hand, the implements of being an artist, as a reference to the reality that women, even up to the 1980s, were marginalized in art schools and in galleries and in collections and in museums and in textbooks. There is also the ageist point of view here, that there's the idealized female nude that populates the history of art, that sets the expectation for what we expect to see. No one before Alice Neel expected the female nude to look like this. And so Neel is showing it as it is, confident, bravado, in a way that's deeply honest and very much aiming to address concerns about what an idealized woman even is and why we have notions of idealized women. We can see some of that at work here in Her Pregnant Woman from 1971. One way we could talk about this painting is by simply looking at it independent of the tradition of the reclining female nude. And if we did that, we would see how Neel is really painting only enough to give you the truth of it all. Notice how the borders are largely left white, left unfinished. She's focusing in the center, in the reality of this figure, in the discomfort that this person is experiencing. She's about to have twins shortly here, and she's finding comfort lying down like this. There's also the reality of what happens to the body during pregnancy, what happens to the breasts, what happens to the rest of the body, the stretch marks. These are the kinds of things that were often kept out of images of reclining nudes, as in the Titian at the right. Titian shows you the idealized reclining nude, and Alice Neel shows you the truthful image. We can even see some of that in the colors used and all the browns around the figure, a kind of foreshadowing of birth. If you've ever seen images of birth, or if you've experienced it firsthand, you know that birthing a child is a messy undertaking, and it's something that is often erased from the whole process. And here Alice Neel gives it to you directly. Another one of the great artists of the middle of the 20th century is Lee Krasner, and she's one that is generally, until very recently, always seen in context with her much more famous artist husband, Jackson Pollock. Here they are photographed together. Pollock is considered perhaps the most important American artist of the 20th century, right up there with Warhol and Hopper and some of the greats. And when he died early in 1956, they were both relatively young, it left an opportunity for her to continue working as an artist in her own right, but also to protect his legacy. So some of the connection to Pollock is by her own doing, that she was there protecting his legacy. A famous artist at the time in New York in the middle of the 20th century, Hans Hofmann, had this to say: "This is so good, you wouldn't know it was done by a woman." And you have to remember that this is the kind of thing that someone like Lee Krasner or any of the artists we've mentioned would have to deal with. Here we see the role that earned Marcia Gay Harden an Oscar, the Best Supporting Actress for playing Lee Krasner in the film Pollock. There she is standing in front of a painting by her husband as she looks over at him in the gallery, recognizing that he's not enjoying this. That's the look on her face that says, I really need to get this man out of here because he's not enjoying any part of fame or attention or critical inquiry. After Pollock dies in the 50s, Krasner is able to blossom more as an artist in her own right. Here in an image, Gia, the mythological character worshipped as a universal mother, the figure who created the universe, giving birth to the Titans and humans, a kind of Mother Earth symbol, one signified by references to bodies in this work, but also certainly references to eggs. You see all the egg shapes here, a kind of symbol of womb and birth. One of the great artists of Krasner's generation is Frankenthaler, Mountains and Sea. Frankenthaler thins her paints down in such a way that they're a bit like varnish. If you've ever varnished anything, you know how thin it can be. And she moves the canvas around, letting that thin varnish paint find its way around. And this is the kind of art that we see in Krasner and Frankenthaler's generation by a group of artists who are trying to get out away from their own genders. And so Mountains and Sea doesn't directly reference her gender as a woman, but it indirectly does by ignoring it, by showing you that Frankenthaler can play in the same arena as some of the great abstractionists of her day. Into the 1960s, we start to see more and more conceptual work, including this piece by Yoko Ono called Cut Piece. Now look at the date of these performances, 64 and 65. This is before Yoko Ono met John Lennon in 1966. They met briefly at a gallery opening, and they got together in 68. Now this is a full 4 years before that. In some ways, history has painted Yoko Ono as a figure who destroyed John Lennon's career by breaking up the Beatles, but actually the opposite is more true, that Yoko Ono was considered a very important, relevant artist in her own right before linking to John Lennon. And when she links to John Lennon, she loses some credibility initially, in part because of some of the narratives surrounding the breakup of the Beatles. In Cut Piece, Ono sits motionless on stage in a performance. There's a pair of scissors that the audience is encouraged to use to cut off her clothing. She doesn't engage with the people who are cutting off her clothing. They're given very basic instructions about what they're allowed to do here. And little by little, the performance piece shows you how she becomes more and more naked as people remove her clothing piece by piece by piece. Now imagine yourself sitting up on a stage when total strangers can grab a freezing cold pair of scissors and put that pair of scissors on your skin, how cold that would feel, or how you might feel violated, or you might feel worried that someone might come along and do harm to you. And that is the nature of the piece, that this is about vulnerability. This is about having no control. This is about other people determining what you're allowed to wear, and other people ultimately exposing your nude body. So we start to get, in conceptual pieces like this, more and more direct references to the female body and to power and issues therein. Yayoi Kusama is an artist that thinks very much about her own life and her own background. She was born into a prosperous family in central Japan, and as a woman, she had a set of expectations along those lines, a set of expectations that she ultimately ignores and denies. And it's for that reason that her mother especially was incredibly abusive towards her emotionally and financially and physically. So much so that it triggered a lifelong mental health issue in Kusama, one where she hallucinates dots, a kind of OCD where the hallucination encourages her need, the compulsive need to dot everything around her, and how pieces like these, Infinity Mirror Room, come as a result of that. You can see all the dots on everything that surrounds her. These are the kinds of pieces that come right out of those performances that we've seen with Yoko Ono, performances that we've seen with Alan Kaprow, performances that are becoming more and more powerful and relevant in the 1960s. Here, Kusama shows you self-obliteration by dots, erasing herself by making herself part of the world around her. Again, as a woman, her family rejected her artistry and rejected her completely, gave her a lump sum and told her to leave the family. And so this is about what happens to an artist that needs to create art, even despite those gender-based family roles and expectations. Something similar with Eva Hesse, here with Contingent, something that on the face of it doesn't look like a feminist work or something that doesn't look like it's about womanness, but actually it is, because Hesse is showing her audiences something that she firmly believed, that the art world of New York in the 60s was male-centric. The art world in New York had a variety of different styles, but one of them is minimalism, as you can see at the right, Donald Judd's minimalist work, a series of repeated forms stacked one on top of the other. Hesse is borrowing those repeated forms of Judd in a nod to his work to suggest that Judd and his fellow minimalists, mostly men, are able to gain a different status in the art world because of their gender, whereas artists like Hesse are not able to achieve that same level of power. Contingent also offers you something different than the metal that you see in the Judd. At the right, it's machine-made and metallic and hard, and at the left, it's much more gentle and much more soft and more organic. When you walk by this piece, it will move ever so, and that's a built-in critique of the very heavy kind of work of her minimalist contemporaries. With Hesse, we see some references to the female body, as with Schema, a reference to breasts, especially a kind of comic mockery of the nude female body as a subject in art. And in her work, we see her take on all kinds of themes that are in contrast with the very heavy minimalist contemporary work that you see here at the left. In Rope Piece at the right, this is a sculpture that denies gravity. At the left, we have something very heavy that lives on the ground, and at the right, it's dangling from the ceiling in a very light way. All of this, a built-in critique of what she's seeing as a male-centric style of art. By the early 1970s, we see more and more artists grappling with not only gender, but with race and with different identities in their work. One of those artists is Betty Saar, and one of her most famous pieces is The Liberation of Aunt Jemima. If I gave this talk a few years ago, very few people would be up on the history of Aunt Jemima. Now we know that it's become a different kind of issue because more of us have been made aware of the history of Aunt Jemima recently. Jemima as a term comes out of the term mammy. Mammy is this caricatured, Black, overweight woman who cared for the white children on a plantation, and then a caricature that we find in all kinds of places after the Civil War, in vaudeville, in advertising, in product sales. And here we find it in Aunt Jemima. At the left, we have different versions of Aunt Jemima. the very Europeanized version in the background, all the tiled images of her, more Europeanized styled features. We see the blackface version of her in the center, and then we see the classic mammy figure as she's holding the, in this case, screaming child that she's looking after. But look right in front of that image of the mammy with the screaming child, and you'll see a black power fist. Do any of you see that black form right in the center of the image here? If you can see my cursor, right in front of the mammy with the child, that's a black power fist. And that's something that is disguised, but also there if you know what you're looking for. So this is what she calls the liberation of Aunt Jemima. We see the idea of mammy picked up on by a variety of artists, including Carrie Mae Weems, who, as she says, I'm trying to heighten the kind of critical awareness around the way in which these photographs were intended. At the left, Carrie Mae Weems re-photographs a very famous photograph, the photograph of the Black woman from the 19th century. And on top of re-photographing it, she dyes the color to give it an ominous red, and she frames it in a circle to look a bit like the end of a bullseye. And then mats and frames this behind a piece of etched glass. And on that piece of etched glass is the phrase that she wrote. You became mammy, mama, mother, and then, yes, confidant. Ha, a kind of metaphor for how we read people. The glass is transparent. We don't see it, but we look through it to read this figure. What she's suggesting is we see other people as if through lenses, not for who they are, but through the lenses that society has created for them. And in her mind, this includes the mammy figure as well. A similar kind of work from the same decade in the 70s goes right to the heart of identities. In this case, Judy Chicago goes to the heart of the history of women, both in culture and in the arts. If you were to make a work of art about the history of women, who would you include? Who are some of the most powerful women in all of recorded history? And what are the shapes that you would use? We can see here, this is a large-scale sculpture, a giant dinner table, hence the title, The Dinner Party, with three sides that are equal, an equilateral triangle. And the triangle itself is a symbol of power, especially historically related to women seeking power. And so even in the choice of the triangle, it suggests something about women and power. On the inside of that triangle is a tile floor. You can see the detail here with the names of 999 women scribed on the bottom there. She works with a team of artists, you can see at the right, to get all this done. This is a very big project. And then on the outside, the three table sides, you have 13 place settings on each side for a total of 39. Now, the number 13 alone should ring some bells for you, because 13 is always considered either a very unlucky number, hence 13 people at the Last Supper turns unlucky, or a very holy spiritual number. And so here, she gives you three place settings with three different moments in time, all representing powerful women. On the first wing of the piece is prehistory to the Roman Empire. And look at some of the women included. Ishtar, fertility goddess, Hatshepsut would have been great. Judith, as we've seen from the beginning, Judith and Holofernes. These are the heroines from prehistory to Roman Empire. The very first one is the primordial goddess, originally called, in her mind, the primal vagina. She calls this the original source of all life, suggesting a kind of role of women as creators associated with primordial earth. Notice how the plate evokes a kind of flesh and rock imagery, symbolizing ties between the female body and Mother Earth. The runner underneath suggests even the notion of animals hunted and shells collected at that time. In the second wing, from the beginnings of Christianity to the Reformation, we find again all kinds of fascinating people from history. Artemisia Gentileschi, where we began our lecture, is included here. Elizabeth R., that's Elizabeth Rex the First, Isabella d'Este, and Theodora. Theodora depicted at the left. Theodora was born around 500 in Crete or Syria, we don't know, into the lowest classes of Byzantine society. Her father was an animal trainer, and she became an actress to support her family. But in those days, that career as an actress was synonymous with prostitution. And for this reason, an emperor of Rome, in this case, Emperor Justinian, would not have been allowed to marry an actress. But when you're the emperor, you can change the rules, can't you? So he changes the rules so that he can marry her. And she goes on to have an amazing rags to riches story in the Byzantine era. Here we see reference to the Byzantine in the place setting. Underneath the plate is something that looks like a mosaic, like the famous mosaics in Ravenna in Italy of none other than Theodora and her husband, the Emperor Justinian. Fascinating piece. And then you have the third wing of the dinner party with more names that you'll know: Sacagawea, Susan B. Anthony, Emily Dickinson, Virginia Woolf, and it ends, all 39 place settings at the table end with Georgia O'Keeffe to underscore how important she was in the history of contributions, not only to art, but to society by women. And notice again in the place setting how O'Keeffe is referenced here, referencing the discussion about her flower imagery and how they may or may not be autobiographical. They may or may not reference O'Keeffe's naked body. And so Chicago doubles down on this, showing you a plate, very three-dimensional version, in order to comment on how O'Keeffe's work was often viewed through the lens of stereotyping in that way. Same kind of idea in the late 70s of exploring female identity in art brings us to Cindy Sherman, photographer who did a series called the Untitled Film Still series, a series of about 130 photographs that are meant to look more like film stills, as if you just cut up an old film reel and pulled out one piece. What Sherman is suggesting is that if you look back in the 40s and 50s, 60s, at images of women in mass media, but especially images of women in film and television, especially in B movies and film noir and the like, you will find only so many characters for women. If you went back and did the numbers, you'll find that men played many more characters in this genre than women did, but there were a limited number of roles that women played. And you can see in these film stills all the different roles that you'd find women actors playing in B movies and the like, television from the period. Here's another example of a film still. We have the Hollywood starlet type figure who wakes up at some point in the afternoon here, still partially dressed from the night before, as a kind of caricature. And we've seen this caricature in cinema for a long, long time, even today. We've seen the caricature of the figure that is in the work at the left, the Mary Tyler Moore figure. The young girl goes to the city to make it big. And again, we see these roles recycled over and over and over. Sherman even does this kind of read, referencing art from history. Here in a photograph that's untitled at the left, Cindy Sherman shows you herself as the character in a Raphael painting at the right, La Fornarina. Notice at the right how Raphael's painted her with that bracelet up on her upper arm there. That's what Raphael's put in to suggest a certain kind of ownership over her. This is Raphael's special mistress, as it were. And Raphael shows her pointing out her nude body with her finger toward the breast and doubling down on her eroticism. Well, Cindy Sherman changes this, doesn't she? Sherman shows you a nude body, but it's a prosthetic. If you look up on her shoulders, they're rather like bra straps, that her own naked body is underneath that prosthetic, that she doesn't have to be objectified as a naked person in this art. She can hide behind the prosthetic. There's also the reality that Sherman is the artist here, and therefore the one in control of the work of art. At the right, whoever sat for this painting is not in control. Raphael's in control and paints her any way he likes, including over eroticizing her. Whereas at the left, Sherman, the artist, is now very much in control. Rounding out this late 70s era is Laurie Simmons' new bathroom. This is a photograph of a room in a dollhouse. Here, this figure in high heels is cleaning the bathroom as a nod back to the different set of expectations that have been on women in the West, especially for some time, the kind of domestic goddess who is expected to do all these various things. Laurie Simmons shows you all of this by paying particular attention to the dollhouse, to suggest the dollhouse is a way that society traditionally has taught young girls to be comfortable with the domestic role. Little boys didn't traditionally get dollhouses or tea sets. These were things that little girls got traditionally to be comfortable with being a server of tea or keeping the house tidy and in order. Little boys got dump trucks and the like. Here, compared with Ozzie and Harriet, one of many shows that could work, this kind of role that media played in promoting these ideas, that women were expected to be beautiful and sexual and also domestic goddesses, keeping everything together. All of this encouraged, as you are well aware, the publication of Friedan's famous book, The Feminist Mystique, Feminine Mystique, a book very much about dissatisfaction, the idea that women are not always happy with the set of societal expectations on them. We start to see more and more of this emerge in the late 60s and early 70s. Here, a photograph of the Miss America pageant protest in 1968, when women are putting things that oppress them into a burning garbage can. And what goes into that garbage can? Bras went in the garbage can, magazines that encouraged women to be successful only in the domestic realm, they went into that garbage can. Copies of Playboy, Ladies' Home Journal, they all went in there. And this started the idea of the theme of bra burning. Here you have it, this notion of where that idea takes off. Here in Laurie Simmons' Walking House, she gives a nod back to something you've already seen, Louise Bourgeois. At the right, a drawing, and at the left, a performance of the kind of societal expectations. Hannah Wilke is an artist that's an inheritor of all of these ideas here in her Starification Object series. Notice the poses of these women. They are rather like a Playboy centerfold. These women are not, these poses are not shying away from the nakedness, but embracing it, encouraging it. And this is in concert with all those little forms that are all over the bodies. Do you see all those tiny little sculptures that are pressed all over her body? This is a photograph that emerges after a performance. And it's a performance where the audience is given gum to chew, and you give your chewed gum back to the artist, and she puts it in a kind of vagina type shape, and she puts that on her body. And so it looks like scarification, but if you look closely, it's not supposed to be repulsive. Instead, it's supposed to be a reference to the female body. All kinds of fascinating comments on gender, including by Barbara Kruger. Your gaze hits the side of my face. You see how the side of her face is shadowed like this? That when you gaze deeply at someone, it's something that could almost feel like an assault, where you are a woman and you're walking past a group of men, let's say, and they gaze upon you and they say inappropriate things to you. It's an assault. And this is something that Kruger is suggesting by that shadow on the face, that your gaze, even without touching me, even without doing anything, your gaze is something that women can feel. They can feel what it's like to be sexualized and othered in this way. Laurie Simpson deals with the idea of gender with wigs, a series of hairstyles that is very much about a series of hairstyles that's very much about Black identity. Simpson, Black artist, takes the idea of gender and pushes it one step further, that comments on hair. Lorna Simpson, as a Black woman, is suggesting that hair is a marker in a way that we see racism evolved. And here she prints all of these hairstyles together to neutralize them, to suggest that we shouldn't be using anything to separate people, genders, races, even especially if we're using parts of the body like this. There's so much more that we can talk about that would take us into lots of different twists and turns of identity in the body and abstraction, but sadly, my time has run out. But I am certainly very interested in your thoughts, very interested in your personal experiences of any of this, and the kind of way art has been used historically to promote ideas of what it's like to be a woman. From the domestic realm, we saw a celebration of motherhood with Kaufman, all the way to the kind of artwork that deals with bigger issues of race, gender, and class, and so on. Thanks so much. Looking forward to a few of your comments.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, Matt. That was really fantastic. There were, I saw Eileen had asked earlier, is the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum only in Santa Fe, New Mexico, or are there others?
The major place to see Georgia O'Keeffe's work is at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum in Santa Fe. Lots of places around the world have great collections of her work, but if you want to see a museum devoted to her, you've got to go to Santa Fe, and that's a very good place to visit. So I would encourage you to get there, to see the museum, and to spend some time there.
Okay, Marna, go ahead if you want to unmute.
Yes, hi, Matt. Thank you for the discussion. As far as, there are two things. One, the artist Keane with the children with the big eyes, wasn't his wife really credited at the end with painting him? And also with Krasner and Pollock, wasn't she supposed to have painted some of his paintings, or is that hearsay?
Less so in Krasner. With Krasner, we have a more solid record of what she's done. We give her the role of becoming the figure that protects her husband's legacy and often comments on it in her work. But as far as painting, there have been rumors here and there, but Pollock, largely, we know he's done his own work. With Keane, yes, there's even a film about this, which I haven't seen, but it goes into the role behind a famous artist that many artists throughout history have had to deal with. We talked about this
like the Kingmaker.
Yeah, right. We talked about this with the Judith Leister, that for a long, long time, people believed that this was all the work of Frans Hals, just because he was a man and talented and had the access that we would have assumed only a man had. So sometimes we do see it where a male artist would get the credit. Absolutely.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, a lot of, everybody commenting in here, very interesting, very informative, really eye-opening discussion. Very surprised to see and hear the varied information on the women of the arts. Thank you so much. That's Rose that added that in. And Berna had added in earlier that women were excluded from almost everything, you know.
This could have been a conversation about women in literature, women in the sciences, women in, you name it, firefighting, space agencies, any topic you want, we could have done. That takes me out of my wheelhouse. I feel very comfortable talking about the history of women in the history of art. And even as a man, am very careful about the parameters of the conversation to do what we've done here. But absolutely, this is something that extends well outside of the world of art into all kinds of other silos.
Absolutely. I see. Is there anyone else that has anything they want to add for Matt? Any questions or adds or comments? Great. Let's see. Max, Mariana, go ahead. Hold on one second. Let's just, go ahead.
Yeah. I've seen O'Keeffe's work is just magnificent. I do love it. Everybody should go to Santa Fe and take a look at her work.
Please do. Yeah. And if you can't get to Santa Fe nowadays, digital reproductions of so much artwork is available. So at the very least, just take a look at some work on a screen, and it's also still moving.
Mhm. What is the predominant reason now you think that women are just still so held back in art? Because right now it's hard for a woman to get a show. And I've heard for one artist at New York, I've forgotten her name, unfortunately, but she found it very difficult to get her work. And she has been working for years. She said for almost 20, 30 years. What's the reason? What's holding us back now?
I wish I had an answer, because if I had an answer, we would be able to take my answer and engage in a lot of major change in society. I sadly don't have the answer. I don't know what it is. I think some of it is a long legacy where women have been excluded. I can tell you from a personal point of view, I started teaching at an art college maybe 20 years ago or so. And in those days, 3/4 of the students in the room were men. Now, every bit of 60–70% of the people in that room are women. So I've seen it firsthand, where you're seeing more and more women interested in the arts, more and more women going to university to get a degree in the arts, and therefore this will spill over to having more and more women in the arts writ large. You would think that that would mean it would
More
extend into having more and more women in major shows and so on, but we just haven't seen that. Now, I think we will. I think if we continue to double down on the idea of inclusion and putting everyone on a level playing field, you'll see more women. There are some women who have made very powerful careers for themselves, as there are many men who have made very powerful careers in the arts for themselves, but there is still a hangover. There is still, sadly, some sexism that we can find peppering so much of the conversation. So I really wish I knew how to stop that, but I think talks like these help. I think they help to establish a long, solid, wonderful history of women, not only in the arts, but making art about women, and that changes things. So more exposure will hopefully mean more prominence.
Yeah. Okay, Marna, go ahead.
Do you think it's because, like in sports, there's not funding for women in the arts and exhibits, like I said, like in sports, it took a long time for women to get paid on a certain level. Even then, even now, the playing field, so to say, is not equal. So does it have to do with finances?
It would be one of the many reasons that we don't find an even playing field, but it is certainly a real reason. There are now more and more opportunities for women to show their work, or to get funding, or to get fellowships, and some are written in such a way that they encourage women to go into the arts or encourage art by women. So we'll see more of that, where people are trying to, and agencies and nonprofits are trying to make up for this, that there should be more funding for women in the arts. And We see some of this, absolutely. But there's also the level of backlash. So if I gave you a talk today about, my favorite women artists, you might say, well, isn't that kind of sexist to just grab a bunch of art by women and put it all together in a category? Think of a museum, if a museum did that, if they just took two galleries and just took their Excel spreadsheets and sorted everybody by gender, and then just put 40 works of art by women in a room, you would say that's kind of pigeonholing, and that reduces their contribution to their body and to their identity as a woman. And that gets into a lot of complexities. And so that's why today we looked at art about women by women, because that gives us a reason to group this together. So I think there's still some fear on the part of exhibitors or publishing companies and the like around the idea of what happens when we group women together like this. Is it problematic? So it will change, and it is changing slowly, thankfully.
Yeah.
Not a hobby for them. Not a hobby.
Pardon, it's not a hobby?
I said, but, a lot of times women artists years ago, they'd said, oh, isn't that cute? She paints as a hobby, or she's a ceramist,
Right.
ceramicist as a hobby, but they didn't take it professionally, take it seriously professionally.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because you've just seen Judy Chicago's dinner party. Now, did you all notice that there is a element of the traditional arts for women? As you say, ceramics. Remember that tile floor? Okay, so that's a nod back to a kind of art that women were, quote, allowed to do. And then even the place settings, the weaving, another art that women were allowed to do. So, as you say, a hobby. Traditionally, women were not allowed to be painters, sculptors, and architects. And we don't have a whole long list of women who were painters, sculptors, and architects. But you see women as weavers and ceramicists and watercolorists. And Judy Chicago used that very reality in her piece as a kind of recognition of that fact, but also to kind of take something that marginalized women and promoted them, to flip the angle a bit.
Yeah. Rose, go ahead. I see your hand up.
You were saying in sports, you notice how many portraits, photographs of the male athletes, but yet you see very few, if any, female athletes, and they train just as hard, just as much as any male, and sometimes even harder. And yet we don't see anything showing that, reflecting the hardness that they go through to become equal.
This is a conversation. I don't have any numbers around, say, Wheaties boxes, but you all remember Wheaties boxes. Yeah. I'm sure if you looked at the numbers, you would see that it isn't 50-50 with gender. And there is even a conversation more recently about Olympiads that have won major awards, expecting great big contracts from Nike or something. Well, they don't always come. Yeah. But you find art or athletes who happen to be male more likely to get some kind of commission like that. Not always, but the data speaks for itself. Certainly, we find it in sports. We find it in a lot of places. I am so thrilled with this conversation. I'm thrilled that we are rethinking about these issues. I'm thrilled that we're all awake and alert and open to the reality of what's going on around us. And I'm thrilled that we can see how art has participated in these conversations. Think of what Gentileschi had to go through. Think of what O'Keeffe had to go through. Think of what all of these artists had to go through, that because they were women, that was something that was always mentioned. Now, you traditionally don't see an artist's maleness mentioned. You don't say Pablo Picasso, a male artist from the early 20th century. You never see that. But you will often see Georgia O'Keeffe, a female artist, or referenced by her identity. So it's great that we've had this conversation, and I hope it continues you to think about all of these topics. It's been such a pleasure to be with you all.